Welcome back to In-Depth Literature. Make sure you guys please hit that like button and subscribe for more epic literature-related videos, book videos. Who knows, maybe your favorite author will be featured on here as well. We just covered John Gardner. We're actually going to be covering John Gardner again today in the context of Beowulf. Make sure you guys follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist Official. And please check out all the playlists that I've curated personally just for you to cater to all your literature book needs. So the story of Beowulf and Grendel and the king of the Gates and the Danes, this ancient story of good and evil, of paganism versus Christianity, this ancient story of the hero's journey. Some of you may be familiar with the epic Beowulf, and that is going to begin our lecture today, and it's also going to fuel the insight and the philosophies for two other works that we're going to be covering in the universe of Beowulf. The first one being a sort of postmodern retelling by John Gardner entitled Grendel. It's definitely an exciting, epic, unique read. Very unlike the original story Beowulf, but the one that was definitely necessary in my opinion. And thirdly, we are going to be featuring Micheal Crichton's The 13th Warrior, formerly known as Eaters of the Dead. There's also a film, an amazing film, great epic film with Antonio Banderas. So if there's any other retellings of Beowulf, any great translations that I should be aware of, I know there's one by J.R.R. Tolkien. We're going to maybe try to work on two in the future. Please let me know if there's any other good versions of Beowulf. And the reason we're featuring all of these novels is because they stay relatively faithful to the ancient proto-medieval folklore that is featured in Beowulf. They have similar themes. Sort of the overall hero's journey is there, the religious journey is there, the spiritual journey is there, albeit from a whole host of various different narrators, perspectives, and characters. So composed roughly around the 9th and 10th century AD, basically the story of Beowulf begins with King Hrothgar, king of the Danes, and he's protecting his great hall, which is being terrorized by an ancient sort of Yeti-esque creature that we come to know as Grendel. Grendel terrorizes the Mead Hall, which is basically where these Northmen, these ancient sort of, what Ibn Falan in the 13th Warrior would refer to as the Northmen, and they are being constantly terrorized by Grendel, and his mother, whom Grendel lives in a cave with, also is part of this sort of terrorist organization, if you will, that is harassing the Gates, as well as various other Northmen cultures. And so the overall story of Beowulf, it may come across as it's cliche, maybe you've heard the story before. I'm not going to go over all the idiosyncrasies of the story, but there is a character arc sort of on a social, spiritual level. These ancient cultures were undergoing sort of what we would consider the early process of Christian indoctrination, if you will, however you want to look at it, conversion/indoctrination. And there is a battle of the two faiths. A lot of these ancient men, this whole ancient culture, Hrothgar's culture, in Beowulf, although they cling sort of passionately and desperately to the ancient pagan-esque ways of burial and ceremony, and the ways that they interact with marriage and prayer, and the way that they sort of still refer to and call upon these ancient gods, is a thing, although there is an omnipresent Christian philosophy, a Christian hope of salvation. And sort of the way that Grendel comes up in the universe of Beowulf to sort of confront these ancient Northmen, Beowulf is sort of a vessel for this sort of anti-Christian evil, this ancient, maybe pagan-esque evil that the Danes and King Hrothgar are trying to sort of defeat. And that'll come up later with Grendel as well as the 13th Warrior. So some other things to sort of mention is that obviously Beowulf is called to help King Hrothgar and the Danes and protect the Mead Hall. And then later on he fights a dragon. He eventually defeats Grendel as well, right? It says here, later Beowulf fights a dragon who terrorizes and hoards gold. So we also have this sort of Tolkien-esque sort of dragon serpent-like philosophy where this ancient dragon is sort of, also terrorizing these ancient peoples, and the dragon will also come up significantly in Grendel, as well as the human dragon. We'll talk more about that when we get to the 13th warrior. And obviously Beowulf is mortally wounded and he dies, and his community, his culture mourns his death. But there is this hope of salvation and this hope of an afterlife, sort of through the Christian lens, but also throughout the heritage and the heroism that exists in this ancient Northman culture. The Scandinavian, if you will, culture is, although they are dealing with the early encounters with the Christian philosophy, the Christian faith that eventually overcomes their entire culture, mostly a very barbaric time in European history. The hope of salvation exists through this omnipresent Christian idea that comes up with these characters in Beowulf, but also the heroism, the legacy of all the forefathers, the grandfathers, the ancient warriors. That is also part of what offers these characters rebirth after the death of their hero Beowulf. And the story kind of leaves off in a manner that would offer a sequel. And interestingly enough, I think that's why we are still talking about the Beowulf legacy, the legacy of Grendel and Beowulf and Hrothgar and the Geats and the Danes, is because it is such a relevant story. It's not just as simplified as good and evil, but it's also the way that heritage influences sort of our worldview, and the fact that we are not only protecting our own sort of existence, our own sort of culture, but we're doing that sort of in praise of the ancient cultures, the ancient families that we came from. And this whole idea of honor and sacrifice and putting yourself in the face of danger is essential to the story and to the character arcs of these wonderful warriors in Beowulf. The stoic acceptance of death, sort of this rapture through death and violence that also comes up in all these stories that we're going to cover tonight, is part of the salvation of the Beowulf legend. And now that sort of goes twofold. That works both ways, between the violence that is needed to overcome the evils of Grendel and his mother, right, from the Northman's point of view. Also, like John Gardner sort of explores and celebrates for us, that sort of rapture, that bliss through violence, that retribution through violence is also present on the side of evil. And that's why we have so many ancient and current modern day struggles, because there's this sort of fanatical idea that through violence, men and women in humanity can achieve sort of this morally upright oasis, if you will, and that through that violence, through that sacrifice, through that constant engagement with danger, hope of salvation and rebirth, and sort of the heavenly offerings, the heavenly sort of rewards are offered to you through almost sort of like this blood meridian-esque, and we'll talk more about sort of blood meridian and how it goes hand in hand with 13th warrior, but sort of this virtue through violence, if you will, that sort of this idea through retribution or sort of rebirth through violence is basically what I'm trying to get. And that comes up not only in Beowulf, but also in Grendel, and as well as the 13th warrior. Now, before we move on to the other novels, I did just want to sort of have this open conversation with all my viewers. And how do you interpret Beowulf? I think there's a lot of different ways to interpret Beowulf. It's a religious story. It is a spiritual journey. It's sort of a social dynamic of good and evil, but it's also sort of a clash of cultures, right? And sort of, we talked about the blood meridian thing. Obviously, that was a horrific, violent clash of cultures that occurs in the universe of Cormac McCarthy, but also in all these other novels that we're going to discuss. They all go back to this sort of demonizing another group or another culture for their otherness. Now, whether that is sort of the Geatish people, King Hrothgar's clan, sort of misunderstanding the motives and the violence of Grendel. We don't get much of Grendel's humanity in the pages of the original Beowulf. This just happens to be the Signet Classic Edition, translated by Burton Raphael. I definitely recommend this translation. It's an older translation, but it definitely gets the job done. And as I was reading the story of Beowulf, I had some preconceived notions of maybe what it was about. I heard, obviously, a lot about the original Old English translations, and that there were a lot of complaints that it was almost impossible to understand. So if you don't want to wrestle with the Old English translations, which I definitely don't recommend unless you're familiar with it, I'll pick up a modern translation. It doesn't have to be super modern, but it can be from the last 50, 60, 100 years, and you will get a lot out of it. And I just felt totally immersed, as John Gardner talks about with the continuous dream. I felt totally immersed in the universe and the pages of Beowulf. And you can take this whole story of good and evil and self-sacrifice and, all this stuff that comes up in Beowulf, and you can put it in a cultural sense, but you can also put it in a heroic personal sense of what is your life going to amount to. We did get a haircut, by the way. I hope you all like it. Looks pretty spiffy. I wanted a little bit more of a fade and a little bit longer on the top, but we can always make adjustments. So it's both a social, a spiritual, a philosophical, and a personal journey. And I think that's why Beowulf is still relevant today. That's why we're discussing Beowulf. So, if you have anything you want to offer into the history of Beowulf, into, your favorite translation, into maybe some great films based on Beowulf, some great translations. Maybe we could talk about the Tolkien translation. That's sort of our little mini introduction to Beowulf before we move into John Gardner's Grendel. Now, interestingly enough, by the time John Gardner's career ended, he wrote a very controversial book called On Moral Fiction, where he stated that if you're not writing politically, then you're not writing serious literature at all. And he sort of transitioned, or John Gardner himself wrestled with these different ideas throughout his career. What kind of writer did he want to be, sort of morally and spiritually and sort of philosophically? Moving on to the pages of John Gardner's Grendel, we get this fascinating study of the Beowulf universe, the philosophies of Beowulf, told through, obviously, Grendel's, the antagonist, point of view. But what does that mean, sort of socially and sort of religiously, morally, philosophically? What is John Gardner getting at? And to make a long story short, he's sort of taking a devil's advocate point of view, right? He's sort of saying that, yes, Grendel is the villain of the story, but just what if? What if we played devil's advocate and we told this story rather through the lens, through the mindset, through the emotions of Grendel himself? What story could potentially be told there? And obviously, John Gardner's Grendel is sort of philosophically influenced by Jean-Paul Sartre's sort of postmodern, even Marxist, even sort of post-colonial theory-esque far-left ideas philosophically and sort of existentially, we could say. And John Gardner uses that as sort of a template to sort of justify Grendel's violence and to sort of explain and rationalize / justify Grendel's sort of nihilistic, violent, chaotic worldview. But even going deeper into that, we're going to talk about some of the deeper aspects of how John Gardner wrestles with his own trauma that comes up in this wonderful scene at the end. So we also get this sort of terrible exploration, this really sad, depressing exploration of the otherness that Grendel feels. He looks upon these other Northmen, he looks upon the warriors and even the women of Hrothgar's community, and we get the sense that Grendel feels like a total outsider, like a total degenerate, and he doesn't, although he can sort of rationalize his otherness and sort of the fear and the loathing and the prejudice that these other humans, he's not particularly a human, maybe he's some form of a human, he's more like a yeti, sort of a beast, but obviously we get this terrible struggle of Grendel's otherness, the isolation that he feels. How is he going to ever come to terms with himself and get over sort of this overbearing, sort of almost Freudian-esque pressure and relationship that he has with his mother. His mother keeps him on a very, very tight leash. Probably if Grendel was my son or daughter, I would probably do the same. But we get this wonderful exploration of this conflict of morality and conflict of the self. Who is Grendel? Who does he want to be? What is his ultimate destiny? And unfortunately, he chooses the path of evil. He is not able to sort of find any type of retribution or goodness or positivity in his life because all his only ticket to any of those things is to react in sort of a violent manner to prove his otherness, because he's forever stuck in this ugly existence, this ugly sort of body. Sort of the John Gardner's purpose in presenting Grendel as this sort of disgruntled, misunderstood type of villain is very sort of in lieu or is sort of relevant to Jean-Paul Sartre's sort of nihilistic, deconstructive, revisionist history that he promotes in his philosophies. And John Gardner is sort of doing that in a sense to sort of use Grendel's ugliness, or the fact that he's misunderstood, the fact that he's isolated, as a vessel to sort of promote Grendel's sort of nihilistic violence that Grendel uses to sort of exist in this world with the other ancient characters. And also this sense of meaninglessness in life and the universe also is a huge component in Grendel's motivation to sort of achieve this rapture through violence. And by doing so, he is able to justify his nihilism, his hatred, his isolation, and through this violence, that is sort of Grendel's retribution, right? Because that's the only way that this creature can really relate to anybody around him, is to try to defeat whatever goodness sort of comes up in his life, and sort of his what evil is to him basically is goodness. It's sort of like the reverse of what a normal person or a normal story would sort of explore, is that Grendel's version of evil is basically goodness, and sort of this nihilistic, existential, revisionist, postmodern sort of approach that John Gardner uses. Now, I'm not saying that John Gardner is promoting sort of necessarily on a political level all of these sort of attributes socially and politically and spiritually and morally, but on a philosophic level, yes, John Gardner is taking sort of a postmodern Jean-Paul Sartre-esque nihilistic approach to justify Grendel's plight, to justify Grendel's violence. Now, there is a sequence in the novel where Grendel encounters the ancient dragon who is hoarding the gold that we talked about in Beowulf, but in the pages of Grendel, he has a much bigger influence, and he sort of becomes pals with Grendel and sort of functions as this esoteric occult philosopher that sort of justifies and gives credence to Grendel's nihilistic worldview, and sort of is also a reference to Jean-Paul Sartre's famous work on being and nothingness. And basically John Gardner uses that text from Jean-Paul Sartre and sort of transforms it and sort of regurgitates it through this esoteric knowledge that is spoken to through the dragon. Now, we will read a little bit of that because I think it's relevant here. The dragon says to Grendel here, "I know everything you see. The beginning, the present, the end, everything. You see the past and the present like other low creatures, no higher faculties than a memory and a perception. But dragons, my boy, have a whole different kind of mind." And he sort of leads Grendel down this path of sort of intellectually and philosophically one-upping him. And he's sort of humiliating Grendel because he's getting Grendel to sort of unveil his frustrations and sort of philosophically look up to this dragon that sort of confirms all of Grendel's biases. And the dragon goes on to say, "Things come and go," the dragon says. "That's the gist of it. In a billion years, everything will have come and gone, several times in various forms. Even I will be gone. A certain man will absurdly kill me. Conservationists will howl. Nothing stirring, not even an ant or a spider. A silent universe. Such is the end of the flicker of time, the brief hot fuse of events and ideas set off accidentally and snuffed out by man. Not a real ending, of course, nor even a beginning, mere ripple in time's stream." So we get these references to not only Jean-Paul Sartre, but also this, even going even farther back, even to ancient Greece and Rome, this philosophic idea of defeating this sort of is meaningless, and that we're in this timeless void, this push and pull, the chaotic mechanisms of the universe. And that sort of justifies not only the dragon's chaos, the dragon's evil, but also Grendel. But it also lends itself to the idea that these creatures are so morally bankrupt, and they're trying to rationalize existence to the point where existence becomes meaningless. Their lives are meaningless, so therefore they don't know the difference really between good and evil, but they're using sort of this nihilistic Paul Sartre-esque philosophic nihilism to justify their lack of meaning in their life. And that's really on another level what Grendel explores, what John Gardner explores in the pages of Grendel. And fascinatingly, the reason that I believe that John Gardner was doing this is because we touched a little bit upon the trauma that John Gardner suffered from. We'll talk a little bit more about that specifically right now, because when John Gardner was a really young child, maybe young adolescent, he was working on a field out in Batavia, New York with his brother. They worked on a farm. They were raised in a rural community, and some accident took place and John Gardner's brother was killed. And towards the end of the novel of Grendel, we get this near death, it's not near death, but this after death, sort of pre-death, proto-death experience, where Grendel is sort of having this conversation with this this man, and the sort of the narrative sort of flips here toward on the last page, and it basically says, in this really pitiful sort of last moments of Grendel, where Grendel's being killed, and he cries out for his mama. He says, "Mama, mama, I'm dying, but her love is history. His whispering follows me into the woods, though I've outrun him. It was an accident," I bellow back. "I will cling to what is true. Blind, mindless, mechanical." So that whole section there sums up, if you know anything about John Gardner, if you've looked into and researched his family history, that is so profound. He says here, "His whispering followed me into the woods, though I've outrun him. It was an accident," I bellow back. And John Gardner always claimed that this event was an accident, which I believe it was. I don't think John Gardner killed his brother, but he was forever traumatized by whatever accident took place. They were driving some kind of a tractor or something that sort of, that is used on the farms to, plant seeds or plow or something, and John Gardner's brother was fatally killed. And he says, "I will cling to what is true. It was an accident, blind, mindless, and mechanical." So this is a retelling or an exploration of John Gardner's trauma that he suffered through the death of his brother at such a young age. "I look down past stars to a terrifying darkness. I seem to recognize the place, but it's impossible. I find myself incredibly moving toward it. I look down into a bottomless blackness, the dark power moving in me like an ocean current, some monster inside me, deep sea wonder, dread night monarch astir in his cave, moving me slowly to my voluntary tumble into death." I wrote my annotation here, says, "Knowing the tragedy of Gardner's brother's death makes this incredibly sad and profound." And so we can see how John Gardner used the perspective of Grendel, the character Grendel, to not only explore sort of this cultural otherness, this sort of battle of cultures, battle of wills, battle of faiths and philosophies and religion that existed in ancient times. Because John Gardner, if you know anything about John Gardner, he was very passionate. He was a philosopher of medieval and Renaissance, proto-Renaissance literature, and he uses that as obviously he's using sort of the template in the world and the universe of Beowulf and Grendel because he's passionate about it, but he's also using that nihilistic, sort of esoteric, Jean-Paul-esque on being and nothingness sort of rhetoric to battle with his own demons of existence and of life and of trauma that he still struggled with throughout all of his life, to battle that trauma that he had with the death of his brother, as well as maybe some Freudian tensions that took place between John Gardner and his mother, because the way that Grendel is depicted in this narrative is extremely Freudian. And I forgot to mention here that we need to explain, there's this series of pages, a couple chapters even, where Grendel is going on these very violent sort of psychosexual monologues about all the tortures that he wants to do to the women of King Hrothgar's kingdom, and just some shocking stuff. I could try to read some of it here. Now I'm going to be using some different words just so we don't get pegged by YouTube here. It says, "I decided to unlive her. I firmly committed myself to unliving her slowly and horribly. I will begin by holding her over the fire and cooking the ugly hole between her legs." I laughed harder at that. They were all screaming now, hooting and yawling to their dead stick gods. I would unlive her, yes. I would squeeze out her feces between my fists. So much for meaning as quality of life. I would unlive her and teach them reality. So that is just so ugly and viscerally profound, because we get this knowledge, this evidence that Gardner, not Gardner, but maybe Gardner too, but Grendel himself is completely mentally and psychosexually twisted. And we could assume that in a Freudian sort of sense, it goes back to the fact that he's been sheltered and sort of emotionally stunted and abused by his mother. And perhaps John Gardner felt a little bit of that too. Maybe the family dynamics of the Gardner family, sort of like we talked about in the David Foster Wallace universe, were a huge struggle for John Gardner, or at least the young John Gardner, to sort of come into his own, and that he would never be fully free from the trauma of the death of his brother. And we can see how John Gardner used Grendel's plight and Grendel's struggle and Grendel's worldview to sort of purge himself, if you will, of all these traumas, family, religious, and how he explored sort of these nihilistic, esoteric themes. By the time we get to John Gardner's on moral fiction, he's basically saying that if you're not writing morally upright or philosophical, I actually haven't read that book, but from what I've read of the reviews and the conversations that take place surrounding it, is that he was, although he was trying to, in some of his novels like Grendel, although he uses a, you know, sort of a postmodern rhetoric, a postmodern aesthetic to explore good and evil and trauma and psychosexual Freudian themes, we also get this idea that, you know, that's not good enough. By the time John Gardner's older, he wants to do something even more philosophical. But John Gardner sort of treads the line between sort of these feminist, sort of revisionist influences that come up in his fiction, but at the same time he sort of denounces modern fiction as not morally upright enough, not philosophically rich enough. So John Gardner's a little bit of maybe a hypocrite, or maybe a little bit of that's what makes him such a fascinating writer, is because he never really necessarily finds the exact answers that he's looking for. Neither does he, or neither does his characters, but we can see through not such a great novel as Grendel how he attempts to get to sort of this philosophical vanishing point, if you will, where everything is perfect and there is hope for salvation, there is hope for the soul. But yeah, very, very interesting. So now we're going to be moving on to the 13th Warrior. If you guys have seen the film 13th Warrior, I will say that for a best-selling author like Micheal Crichton, I was expecting the writing and maybe even the story to be a little bit stronger. I found the story to be a little bit unorganized. We're not doing like a book review critique here. We're doing more like an analysis. But just from a sort of a technical point of view, I think the film far outshines the book. Now, the book is almost a completely different story, right? Yes, the film is inspired by it. The script from the film takes a totally different approach. 13th Warrior is originally titled Eaters of the Dead, as you can see there. So anyway, let's get into Eaters of the Dead / the 13th Warrior. Now, this is sort of another retelling of the Beowulf legend, the Beowulf myth, but it surrounds the Northmen, a similar culture to King Hrothgar. It's basically the same characters, you know, Hrothgar and Beowulf, and he uses different names. And this king in Beowulf is being belabored by not one creature like we would get in Grendel or Beowulf, but he's being belabored by this sort of, I don't even know how to describe the Wendo, but there's this ancient sort of goddess worship cannibal cult, and it's these whole group of ancient men, and they are men, we're led to believe. They might be somewhat more like akin to Neanderthals or something more primitive like that perhaps, but they are men, and they sort of worship what we would call now as the Venus of Wollendorf or Wollendorf, sort of this ancient goddess cult. But what Micheal Crichton is doing is putting it in the context of good and evil, and sort of saying that these ancient goddess worshipping pagan cultures were in fact cannibals, and they're nihilistic, and they sort of go around and eat their enemies, hence the title Eaters of the Dead. But also, significantly enough, in Micheal Crichton's Eaters of the Dead / 13th Warrior, we get even a stronger exploration of the clash of cultures through the lens of Ibn Falan, and he is the Arabic sort of ambassador that gets captured or is sort of enticed, demanded to fight with the Northmen, to fight because the 13th Warrior, that being Ibn Falan, they have to choose somebody that's obviously not a Northman. That comes up in the movie. If you want to, you know, maybe a little cheat sheet of Eaters of the Dead. It's one of the few films that I say you could watch before you read the book, because they're not really that related. But the book is a lot darker, a lot more occult, a lot more esoteric, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But sort of like Grendel and Beowulf, the clash of cultures occurs in the Micheal Crichton, you know, Eaters of the Dead. In this case, the clash of the cultures would be the Northmen, the Vikings, if you will, versus Ibn Falan, sort of the Arabic Muslim culture that exists. And they couldn't be more opposite. I mean, Ibn Falan is like this uptight, sort of very cleanly, sort of cleanliness next to godliness sort of guy, and then he gets thrown into this universe with all these heathenistic, uncouth, nasty Northmen. And it's sort of interesting the way that Micheal Crichton sort of presents the Northmen as these primitive, sort of, you know, antiquated, really ruffian, sort of, you know, nihilistic even, very violent, you know, uncouth, but they do have a certain amount of humor. But he sort of uses that in conjunction with sort of this morally upright, philosophically pure, you know, just overall morally upright universe that comes from sort of the strict regimen of Islam. And he's sort of using that as the clash of cultures, as sort of a melting pot to further explore the clash of cultures that occurs with the Wendo, that being the ancient cannibal pagan mother worship cult that eats people, and their class of culture obviously with the Northmen, with the Vikings. So just fascinating sort of retrospective of how Micheal Crichton was able to even do another retelling of the Beowulf legend. Now, sort of religiously and philosophically, there's three different clash of cultures that occur in the Eaters of the Dead / 13th Warrior. And obviously, like we said, that is not only the social culture of the Muslims, the Northmen, and the Wendo, but also the religious spiritual clash of cultures that exist, because we have both the cultures of the, you know, the Northmen and the Wendo, which are both sort of pagan, but at this time the Northmen were obviously being introduced to Christianity like they were in the time period of Beowulf. But also we have within that pagan sort of heathenistic universe, if you will, there's different tiers. Obviously there's the Northmen, the Vikings, sort of, you know, Hrothgar's version of paganism, worshiping the gods. Sort of the chaotic war gods of ancient Scandinavian myth and culture. Also, we have the more extreme, nihilistic, cannibalistic mother cult paganism that is, you know, promoted by the Wendo. And basically, Ibn Falan is forced on this journey to fight for the Wendo, or to fight for the Northmen. And they sound very similar to the characters in Beowulf, and they're sort of act as stand-ins for the Beowulf characters, but they take on, they sort of merge and they transform a little bit, and their character arcs are a little bit different. But so that's an important part of you know, this novel in particular, is sort of not only the social clash of cultures that occurs between Ibn Falan and the Northmen, but also the religious, the sort of the trio of the different sort of spiritual endeavors of all these cultures that are trying to sort of all find themselves within this conflict that is happening all around them with these other cultures, that being Ibn Falan's contact or conflict with having to be forced to spend so much time with the Northmen, and the Northmen are trying to defeat the ancient evil of the Wendo. And sorry, I said Wendo, it's actually Wendo. My brother and I, we used to think it was the Wendo when we first saw the films when we were kids. We were like, Dad, what's the Wendo? But it turns out it's the Wendo, which is Wendo. So exploring a little bit more of the Wendo, they are obviously this ancient, and basically how we come to know that they sort of worship this mother goddess is that we talked about the Venus of Wollendorf, and this statue, this ancient pagan statue of a plus-size woman comes up in this novel, and it is used by the Wendo to sort of worship their what they call the mother of the group. And she is sort of this esoteric ancient witch, and that through her that's why they are continue to worship, and that's how they exist, and that's where they get their power. And if the Northmen and Ibid Fadlan can only defeat the mother, then the whole group basically suffers. The whole Wendo group basically goes extinct. But they do, after Bullywhip or somebody, one of the Northmen warriors ends up defeating the Wendo mother, and he's actually mortally wounded in the process. Very similar to that in the book, but there's a lot more violence in the Eaters of the Dead, slash book of the 13th Warrior than we ever see in the movie. And I think the movie does a much better job of sort of presenting Ibid Fadlan as a hero, as the Northmen as a hero, does a much better job as presenting the Wendo as absolute villains. In the book, it's the lines are very, very blurred, because even towards the end, Ibid Fadlan helps the Northmen sacrifice a North woman to the king that dies after he defeats the Wendo's mother. And we have a lot of human sacrifice that occurs in the world of not only the Wendo. Obviously, they don't really sacrifice people per se; they just kill them and cannibalize them, because that's their culture. There's really no, anybody that's not a Wendo, they basically consume for the power that it gives them, and it sustains their ancient pagan mother cult. But it's sort of like a goddess cult. But going back to the Northmen are also depicted in Micheal Crichton's worldview as pretty nihilistic, as pretty heathen-esque, as pretty, there's several human sacrifices that take place. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of drinking. So the book, Micheal Crichton's book version of the 13th Warrior is much more disturbing. It's much more violent. It's much more akin to something like Blood Meridian, whereas the film, The 13th Warrior, actually presents a much stronger character arc of heroism and of morality and of good and evil, and just a great adventure story. And by the time, obviously if you watch the film, The 13th Warrior, by the time you get to the end of it, you absolutely are rooting for not only the Northmen, but you're obviously rooting for Ibid Fadlan. In this, not so much. I mean, the Ibid Fadlan character, he sleeps with, prostitutes. He is kind of, obsessed with Allah, and he's just a little bit vain, although he does, concur some, or he does achieve a little bit of a character arc through his journey with the Northmen by defeating the Wendo. He's helping the Norwegians. I say Norwegians, but they're more like, I don't know what the modern equivalent would be, Viking culture in general. That's a very sort of, modern generic term, but he's sort of immersing himself in sort of helping these ancient pagan Vikings perform human sacrifice, and sort of assisting them in their very, oftentimes, I wouldn't say nihilistic sort of approach to life and ritual and spirituality and religion, but their sort of very non-orthodox approach to reality. And we can see that Micheal Crichton is sort of not doing this to particularly demonize any one culture, but you could see maybe through a modern sort of lens, if the postmodernists got a hold of this, they would probably say that Micheal Crichton was using, maybe, I don't know, Africans as a stand-in for the Wendo, or maybe he was, some people might even say that he was depicting the Northmen as, these stupid, violent heathens that had no morals, or he might even, postmodern, Marxist types might even, critique his depiction of Islam and Muslim people too, for the fact that they're so sort of morally upright and obsessed and sort of, sort of erotically, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of that sort of cultural eroticism that, that a lot of postmodern people say is part of representing ancient cultures. And I'm not saying I agree with any of those particular critiques or mindsets, but I'm saying there's a lot of different ways that you can read not only the 13th Warrior, but also Grendel and obviously Beowulf. So I think that pretty much covers it. That was like a huge word salad, diarrhea of the mouth / typical Andrew Marlowe literature rant, because it's so complex, and obviously sort of the root of this whole story goes even further back to Beowulf, but also a more modern Tolkien-esque approach would be like the the Farmer Giles of Ham is kind of like another retelling of Beowulf, perhaps too. Obviously Tolkien translated Beowulf. He was a huge fanatic of Beowulf, a linguist. But sort of the root story of where we get a lot of these more modern things, like John Gardner's Grendel, Micheal Crichton's 13th Warrior, even some other modern fantasy, sci-fi type stuff. We get the basic story of it derives from things like Beowulf. Now, there probably were more ancient sources than Beowulf, but even in sort of a Shakespearean sense, maybe a Hamlet-esque King Lear sense, this battle of good and evil, this how evil defeats humanity and families and cultures. But also, on the other hand, though evil is acknowledged in these ancient stories and also these more modern retellings, that there is sort of this nihilistic sort of rapture through violence, this pleasure through violence, perhaps, and not only to preserve these other cultures that are deemed less sophisticated, less morally upright, less religious, less good. There is sort of this thirst for violence, like we would see in Blood Meridian, perhaps. So there's a lot of different ways you can look at it. You can look at it through a more like a historical, religious, spiritual perspective. You could look at it more through a modern social perspective. And I think although these ancient stories are both contingent upon the faiths and the spiritualities that exist, I think that those things are even more, rely heavily more on sort of the social dynamic of good and evil and religion, of the practices of demonizing otherness, right? And a slightly different perspective of if Grendel could achieve a little bit of humanity, or why is Grendel, if you will. We get that in John Gardner's Grendel, obviously. And by the time we get to the 13th Warrior, Micheal Crichton kind of uses the Wendo, the ancient pagan cannibal cult, as sort of a stand-in for Grendel on more of a social, and as sort of like more like a social entity, a social movement, sort of a social evil versus just one yeti in a cave that kills people. So please let me know your thoughts and comments. If there's anything that you think we should add or that we left out of this Beowulf, sort of John Gardner, Grendel sort of lecture, please let me know. I'm not saying that I'm an expert on, Beowulf or ancient, pagan literature or ancient Christian literature or anything like that. I'm still at the cusp of learning all this stuff, but I did want to get on here and kind of discuss it and kind of explain what, the impact that these novels had on me. And that's what we were talking about in one of our book hauls recently, a good way to sort of, further explore a particular book is to read different translations and to read different, retellings of it. So we've read Beowulf, we've read Grendel, and then we recently just finished, Eaters of the Dead by Micheal Crichton. So you can see how this story of Beowulf continues to impact writers, continues to impact people and readers and philosophers and historians and politicians, and that it is not just this old antiquated story that you had to read in high school, right? It is still relevant. I mean, you get so much philosophic and spiritual enrichment from the pages of Beowulf, and I hope that you will explore the universe of Beowulf and Grendel and the 13th Warrior / Eaters of the Dead. Make sure you guys hit that like button. Please subscribe. Follow me on Instagram @AndrewMarloweArtist, and we will see everybody in the next video.